Firing Line with William F. Buckley, Jr. and his guest, Governor George Wallace. Moderator, C. Dickerman Williams. And now, Mr. Buckley.
Mr. George Wallace, as everybody knows, was the governor of Alabama from 1963 until 1967, at which point he turned his office over to his wife, an act of political chivalry which could have occurred only, perhaps, to a Southerner. There are those who say that Mrs. Wallace is governor only in the ritual sense, that it is her husband who exercises effective power. But Mr. Wallace's standing in Alabama is a matter of diminishing national interest. It is his standing outside Alabama, outside the South, that is the subject of anxious speculation, because the vote for Mr. Wallace may very well determine which of the other two major candidates will become the next president of the United States. Mr. Wallace was born in 1919 to a poor family in Alabama. He worked his way through school and took a law degree from the University of Alabama in 1942. He served in the legislature after the war, having done a stint as public prosecutor. Then in 1958, he ran against John Patterson for governor and lost. He is quoted as having said at the post-mortem that he would never again be out-segged in a political contest. That is to say, that he would not permit his opponent ever again to take a position more pronounced than his own in favor of racial segregation. Now that Mr. Wallace is running for national attention, he denies ever having had any animus against the Negro. He now takes, watch and see, positions on public policy which are generally thought of as merely conservative. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Wallace to explain how come it is that a poll of 200 prominent conservatives recently conducted by the weekly journal Human Events reveals what the editors call a, quote, surprising animosity towards Mr. Wallace. Why should that be?
Well, first, I want to comment on your opening statement there, in which you said I was quoted as having said in 1958, after I was defeated, that I was out-segged. That was written in the Time magazine. There's no such expression as seg in the vocabulary of Southerners. I have never heard of the word seg or segged until it was written in the Time magazine, which they are real good at rewriting what is written on the local scene. In fact, recently they wrote, I think, that I made a sucking sound on my teeth when I ate, because they wrote the story that the writer had eaten with me. So when they then sent it to New York, they rewrote it. They rewrote in the Newsweek of the Time one recently, when the writer said he ate lunch with Governor Wallace. Then they in New York rewrote the story and said Governor Wallace picked his teeth with a dirty toothpick. You see, they get in their mind, well, we ate lunch with him. What did he do at lunch? Well, he picked his teeth with a dirty toothpick. I've never made that expression and never made any such statement. I was just as strong for states' rights and local government in '58 as Mr. Patterson. Mr. Patterson won the race because his father had been assassinated after he was elected Attorney General. And there was much sympathy for him, but we ran a good race. But I never made any such, when Time magazine writes that, they told an unmitigated falsehood. I never made any such statement, and now about
you're now taking the position that it's impossible to out-seg you, even in 1958.
Oh, I don't know about the matter of out-segged. I've never run on a segregation platform throughout the country. I've never said that you should have segregation of the school system or any other. In fact, we don't have segregation in Alabama. We've had more mixing and mingling among people of both races in Alabama than they've had in New York State, where you come from.
No, wait a minute.
Oh, yes, that's correct.
No, wait a minute.
All you got to do is go down to Alabama and see. We haven't had any problems in Alabama that exist in you. But let me answer your question now.
Yes, that's a good idea. Yeah.
In the first place, I care nothing about what kind of school system you have in New York or Missouri.
Well, you should.
Alabama.
You're an American.
Well, I care in the sense that I have confidence in local people. The people of Missouri can run their school system without somebody in Washington laying down the guidelines. That's all I'm saying.
Governor, I should direct your attention first to Mr. Buckley's question,
yes, sir, all right,
about why these conservatives are against you, and then
Well,
bring in these other explanations.
Mr. Buckley said that 200 prominent conservatives. That's typical of those who write in magazines. 200. Who were these prominent conservatives? I can go out here to the...
Mr. Buckley, did the magazine list the conservatives?
No, it didn't. But suppose Governor Wallace names a prominent conservative outside the South who's in favor of him.
Well, 107,283 folks signed the petition for me. Those were steel workers. Those were...
No. Mr. Wallace, a prominent conservative in the sense of someone who is nationally known as a conservative.
I run my politics like I did in Alabama. I never went to the county courthouses to see the county governing body. I just went to the people. Now, when you say you put too much credit on the support and influence that some fella in a magazine, a newspaper, or somebody on a college campus that might be conservative, or some minister who may be conservative, but actually I go out to the masses of the people with the message that I have,
Governor,
I don't know any prominent conservative. In the first place, we have overestimated what the editor of a magazine can do in the conservative field.
I think you're directing your attention to why Mr. Buckley's question is irrelevant.
I don't know why the so-called prominent conservatives at human events said they were not for me.
Governor, we try to have responsive answers. Perhaps Mr. Buckley's question is out of order. Is there any? Do you know of any?
I don't know who the prominent conservatives are. Who are they?
Well,
name them.
Your point is that it doesn't make any difference who they are.
It doesn't make any difference to me whether some prominent conservative is not for me. The fact
is there anyone who is for you?
The fact that 70% of the people last night on a poll on a television station in St. Louis said they would support me. The fact that I won the television poll on WIIC in Pittsburgh the other day and defeated Johnson, Kennedy, and Reagan by almost 3 to 1.
And they might have given more votes to Perón than they did to you. Right?
Well, maybe so. That's right.
We're not talking about how popular.
Well, those are smart. That's a real.
Why is it that?
That's a real smart answer to a fact that I won a poll. Is that Perón might have got more votes? That's right.
We know that he got many more votes.
Mr. Buckley, why is it?
You got in Alabama.
Why is it that? Why is it the conservative?
The reason why
is I got more in Alabama than you got in New York too.
Certainly, I don't claim I'm popular in New York. I'm a conservative.
See if we can all talk separately.
Well, just all the conservatives are against me. All the conservative leaders are against me. You say?
You've made
let
the
them
point,
be against me. What difference does it make?
Governor, if I could interrupt a moment, you've made the point that you don't care about the prominent conservatives. Mr. Buckley, I think, might say why he thinks
I didn't care about the support of the conservatives.
Well, it's relatively unimportant.
Why don't you let me talk on this program? After all, I was I would know. I was
supposed to have equal time, Governor.
Oh, this is your program. You own it every week, aren't you?
Mr. Buckley, why don't you tell us why?
No, I thought you invited me to get my opinion. You own here every week. This is your show.
In addition to a number of other things.
Well, why is it, Mr. Buckley, why is it that prominent conservatives are important? Why did you think that was an intelligent question?
I think it's an intelligent question for this reason. I think that Mr. Wallace is trying to persuade a lot of people that he should appeal to them, whereas I think that people who have given their life to studying the problems of America in a conservative framework find that Mr. Wallace is not as completely convincing as he would appear on the basis of, say, a particular television show. And the reason why is that they find that his background is that of a New Dealer, a person who is intensely concerned to multiply the functions of the state, a person who is extremely evasive on the subject of segregation and the race issue, a person who has a gift for
since
such
you said that, since you said that,
Buckley, I think you've gotten in some matters that really weren't relevant. So I think we should give Governor Wallace a chance to reply to.
Well, really, I thought I was supposed to. You wanted my opinion, but when you get on this show, the man who puts on the show wants to do all the talking.
No.
One half.
You're going to get your chance.
Now you've made a statement here that in Alabama. I am for things that you don't think are exactly right. Name one thing in Alabama that I have supported on the governmental level that you are against.
Well, it seems to me that your if I may say so, fanatical concern for using public money for certain functions
what
that might otherwise... Well, for instance, you want to take care of the hospitalization. You want to take care of old people. You want to take care of the poor.
Are you against caring for the poor?
I had a feeling that you would answer that way.
Are you against
I hate the poor. I'm for shooting them, sir. That's what I thought. No, my point is that this is a free enterprise country and that we have a tradition here of private philanthropy, of philanthropy conducted by private people, and under programs that haven't required the mobilization of the machinery of the state, whether at the federal or at the local level. That under the circumstances, the whole tradition of your kind of Democrat is one of enormous enthusiasm for federal handouts in
May
your
I
state.
answer now?
Yes.
May
Up
I?
until such
Mr.
moment,
Buckley, I think
yeah.
you've had enough time. Let Governor Wallace.
In the first place, in Alabama, we have the highest old age pensions for destitute in our state that we find in most any southern state. That is, for people, the average age is 70 years of age. 3% of them are over 90. They're destitute. They're not people who have incomes. I'm for that myself.
You're for what?
For caring for destitute, average age of 70
too.
years old,
It's a
and
question whether it has to
3%
be
over
done
90.
by the government.
Oh, well, it has to be in this instance done by the government.
Why?
For the simple reason
Why
that...
can't it be done by their children in
Well,
many cases?
that's... it just so happens
Or
that...
Alabamans don't take care of their parents?
Well, you have this program in New York, too. You have it throughout the country. It's not that children don't take care of their parents. We have many elderly people in our state and in every state who need help, who have reached the age of 70, the average in Alabama drawing old age pension. So let me say this, that there's no use, we're not going to reconcile our differences there. I am for looking after destitute elderly people. I am for looking, yes, I'm for that. I'm not against that at all. So if conservatism is against looking after the elderly who are destitute, I might say that no conservative in this country who comes out against looking after destitute elderly people ought to be elected to anything. So I'm for that. Second, we provided more money in our state for the mentally ill, the blind, and the tubercular, and the disabled at any time in our history.
Now, Mr.
That's
Buckley,
a humanitarian
let's shift to
program.
Mr. Buckley.
Now,
You regard that as non-conservative, Mr. Buckley? You should.
I regard it, Mr. Chairman, as non-conservative automatically to
Who
assume...
is this chairman we got here?
Automatically to assume... he's a very distinguished lawyer, Governor. Next question.
Trying to provide
he's
equal
also
time.
invited, yeah.
I didn't know you supposed to require equal
as
time. I thought you had me on here to hear
We
my
have to
views.
interrupt
Now,
now.
Mr.
We will be
Buckley,
back in a moment.
Well, continue to answer the question.
The
which
chairman
you've
is
made
in
a
charge of
charge.
this program.
Governor, I'll assure you of equal
You've
time.
made a charge against me that...
No, I haven't made it.
Well, he made a charge.
I'm simply dividing
And he
equal
said we
time,
get
Governor.
federal handouts. Now, I want to talk about that. Yes, we get
No,
federal...
no, first of all, we're going to complete the other point.
Let's complete. Mr. Governor Wallace went on from the elderly people
No,
to the mentally ill. Now, what is your attitude on that?
Your question is it anti-conservative for the state to undertake these functions? My answer to that is, it is not anti-conservative for the state to undertake those functions if those functions have not been satisfactorily undertaken by private associations, the so-called third sector. And it seems to me that Governor Wallace has gone instinctively to Montgomery for state action of this kind before exploring adequately substitute ways.
Well, how do you know? How do
Have
you
you
know?
explored?
Yes, we've explored all sectors, I suppose, of the Department of Public Welfare in our state. We even had a Dependents Act in our state that required you to jail people if they didn't care for their parents. Well, we found that most of these people, you see the majority of these folks who are drawing elderly assistance are Negro. And we are proud that we are helping the elderly, destitute Negro citizens of our state. But we found that many of their sons were in Detroit and were in Chicago and couldn't be located. So we had a law that required them to support their children, and if they didn't support them, they were cut off.
Cut off from what?
Cut off from the old age pension, destitute, the old age pension that was being paid to these destitute people. But then we found that even though a son of a destitute elderly person would not pay living in Detroit or Chicago, when we cut the elderly person off, we caused them to suffer. And so we just said, well, just because we can't get the children in Detroit and Chicago and St. Louis to help the elderly person, we're not going to let them starve. So we explored that sector. So I don't think there's any, the argument is that you don't think the state should help.
Let's get Mr. Buckley's reply to that. Do you think that's anti-conservative? Governor Wallace says they tried to get the children to support their parents, and as I understand, what he says, it was only when they wouldn't support the parents that then the state intervened.
In fact, if there was a vigorous search for substitutes, then quite rightly it falls to the political function to take something on this. But I think it's also true that we know from any knowledge of history of the South during the Roosevelt years and afterward that there has been a considerable solidarity between the South and the New Deal and the Fair Deal with its penchant for increasing federal participation.
You agree with that, Governor?
He was enthusiastic for Kennedy in 1956.
I wasn't enthusiastic, but I supported Mr. Kennedy, yes.
Oh, all right, you support him unenthusiastically. We'll make these distinctions.
You what?
You supported him unenthusiastically.
I voted for Mr. Kennedy,
Yeah,
yes.
that's
I
right.
never denied that.
Well, it seems to me that therefore this situates you.
Mr. Nixon doesn't
is this-
think differently from Mr. Kennedy on probably any item involving civil rights or otherwise. There's not 10 cents worth of difference in the attitude of Mr. Nixon and Mr. Kennedy, but I voted for Mr. Kennedy. That is correct.
There's a considerable
Because
difference
Mr.
between
Kennedy,
attitudes.
his attitude prior to his election of the presidency was such that in 1956, he got the entire vote of the delegations of the South for vice president. Mississippi, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Texas. He had solid support against Mr. Kefauver, our neighboring Tennessean. But now you mentioned the South a moment ago after the New Deal days. Yes, the people of the South wanted to accept and try anything that would help bring them from the bottom of the economic ladder. But of course you haven't told why the people of the South were on the bottom rung of
It's
the
irrelevant.
economic ladder. It's not irrelevant.
It certainly is
It's not irrelevant. Oh, well, of course,
Why don't you tell us why it is
well,
relevant?
all right.
You tell us why
well,
it
if
is
you all
relevant.
will be quiet a minute, I will tell you. But it's hard to talk with you folks all doing all the talking when you invited me here to express my opinion, because I knew this is the way this program would be in the first place.
That's fate.
Second, that people of the South, after the war between the states, didn't have any Lend-Lease or Marshall Aid or foreign aid programs. We had 10 years of vengeance and 10 years of occupation. We had the carpetbaggers. We had the scalawags. The state of Alabama just recently, about 10 years ago, finally paid off all the indebtedness that was shackled on us by even carpetbag legislatures in 1868 and 69 and 1870. We had 5 generations of people who didn't go to school because there were no schools for black or white. All they could do was eat something out of the ground to eat. We had freight rate discriminations placed on the backs of the South. And if you shipped something from Birmingham all the way to New York City until 1950 till we finally got that removed, and since that time the South is beginning to move forward even above the national average. If you bought a piece of steel, if you bought this watch, can I answer?
Sure, go ahead.
All right,
Take the watch.
You have no objections,
No,
all right?
no,
Yeah,
it's,
and look
it's
at
a
the watch
legitimate
every now and
exhibit.
then.
If you manufactured this watch in Montgomery, Alabama, and you shipped this watch to New York over a rail line, you paid anywhere from 45% to twice as much to ship it to New York as you did to turn around and ship it back across the Mason and Dixon line to Montgomery, Alabama, with the same rail crew over the same rail line. Up until 1950, if you bought a piece of steel in Birmingham, Alabama, and shipped it to Montgomery, Alabama, you paid the freight rate from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Montgomery.
Let's get Mr. Buckley's answer to your
Well, no,
proposition.
I'm-
Mr. Buckley, he's making the point that the South, at the opening of the New Deal, was in a position of economic inferiority, and that is the reason why they went along with the New Deal. What is your response to that?
Well, my response to that is that, of course, Northerners are likely to take the position, some of them, of course, did, during
New York went for
Reconstruction.
Mr. Roosevelt, too,
During
didn't it?
Reconstruction,
All
that
that.
it was the
Wasn't
South that caused a civil war that resulted in 1 million deaths. And I think...
you know,
I
this
think
program is getting off of what
Yes, it
I
certainly
came here.
is.
When you say the
It's
South caused a civil war, you came here to talk about conservatism, and yet that's typical of you and your magazine. You come here, all you want to do is insult our part of the
Governor, we
country.
can't have...
Well,
let's
listen,
not
I
have-
don't want to get
Yeah.
into the argument who started a civil
Could I-
war. And
Yes.
when you make the statement
Mr.
that the
Chairman.
South caused a civil war,
Governor,
then we
Mr.
could argue 2 hours on
Governor,
that. and
Mr. Buckley was just...
I resent that. I resent him saying that, and so we're not
Say,
even going
Mr.
to talk about it.
I'm only asking Mr. Buckley if he could legitimize, if he can.
Well, he
Yeah.
said that
The
the
Southern
South caused
support
a
of the
civil
New
war.
Deal.
Mr. Chairman,
I
may I
object to
just
that.
make a historical aside that I have 2 great-grandfathers who were killed on the southern side of the Civil War. The reason, what I'm trying to do is get away from this child's view of history that Governor Wallace is trying to press on us. It is true that there was a systematic exploitation of the South. It is true that it is probably the worst period of American history was our persecution of the South after the Civil War. But it is also true that during the 1930s there was no reason for the South not to have schools, and indeed, of course, the South
We had
did
schools,
have schools, contrary to the suggestion
Well, do you
of
think
Governor
free
Wallace.
enterprise...
But it's also true that certain politicians grew up in the South and they lusted for participation in a type of government which is distinctively anti-conservative, the type of government of which Mr. Roosevelt, Mr. Kennedy, and Mr. Johnson are. Then all of a sudden something happened. The consequences of that federalization also meant that they couldn't continue in their segregated ways, and that's when Governor Wallace was born as all of a sudden a conservative.
What's your comment on that? Now,
Well-
you speak, Governor Wallace, and answer that.
Of course, I was not even voting in the days that you were talking about. I didn't even vote in those elections, but when you say that because the people of the South voted for Mr. Roosevelt, that made them anti-conservative. Well, New York voted for Mr. Roosevelt all 4 times.
New York is very anti-conservative.
Every state in the
Union.
Union.
It wasn't?
Well, the point is, you aiming talking about the South. I can't answer for what people did 75, 100 years ago, or what they thought, or what they did in New York in 4 elections during the times that Mr. Roosevelt ran. But every state in the Union voted for Mr. Roosevelt except Maine and Vermont in 1936, and nearly all of them voted for him in 1940. The
yes,
state
but
of
they
New York voted 4 times. So New York then has a history from which you come of supporting movements the same as Alabama and the South
But they didn't
did.
pose as conservatives. I don't know when last anybody from New York posed as a conservative, except me, and I got 13% of the
Well,
vote.
we haven't got it. Let's get it definitely from Governor Wallace whether he is a conservative or pretends to be a conservative.
Well, now let's get back.
He calls himself a populist.
Let's get
which is
back.
what he
Well,
is.
what if you mean populist? If you mean man of the people, yes, I'm a populist. If that's what you mean by it, I don't know what you mean by populist because you have many definitions of many things. But I'll say that insofar, let's get back to the old age pension. You're against Alabama's looking after the elderly, destitute citizens of the state.
Yeah, we proved that, haven't we?
I'm for that.
Governor, we're trying to get to the question of whether you regard yourself as a conservative.
Do
you attach that label to yourself?
What do you mean by conservative?
You give your own definition. You're speaking.
Conservative to me means that we should allow, on the governmental scene, to allow local people to try to determine policies of local democratic institutions.
How can they without the vote?
Without what?
The vote. The vote, V-O-T-E.
Well,
what steps did you take to encourage the enfranchisement of the Negro back before the government got on your back?
All right, I'll be glad to tell you, I've always made speeches in my state in which I said anybody's entitled to vote regardless of their race or color, qualified under the laws of Alabama, and we had Negro citizens by the thousands who voted in 1958 when I first ran for governor, and I might say it in the runoff for governor, that they voted for me.
Is that because they didn't have the education you're talking about?
No, I didn't say that. They voted for me because they didn't have education. Well, you reflect on the Negro voters of Alabama if you want to, but I don't. They exercised their choice, and their choice was as good as the choice of anyone else. 1962, 100,000 or more voted. In the election in which my wife participated, around 260,000 Negroes voted, and in the general election with 2 opponents in 1966, my wife received more Negro vote than either one of her 2 opponents. And over at Selma, Alabama, this is a matter of statistical record, and you can go check. One of the networks has already checked because I made the statement.
Well, then I don't have to. Then I don't have to.
Governor, let's get Mr. Buckley's response.
My wife received over 11,000 votes in round numbers in Selma.
Governor, let's get Mr. Buckley's response to that. The governor says he's not a racist. This is established by the fact that the Negroes... Let's get Mr. Buckley's response.
Will you let me finish my statement?
I tell you, we don't have speeches. We have conversational discussion.
She got 2,000 votes for the combined total of her 2 opponents.
You've made your point. Let's get Mr. Buckley.
Well, half the voters on that day were Negro voters.
We have to interrupt now. We will be back in a moment.
Why do you...
I think we get your point, Governor. Mr. Buckley, what have you got to say to that? The Negroes have voted for Governor Wallace.
What I have to say is...
do you think, is he right? Are his facts right? Or
I don't...
Are his conclusions right, or what?
Well, I can't answer, Mr. Chairman, as long as you keep elongating your question.
I don't want either one of you to question the facts in this case. Now, if
Do you accept my answer, Mr. Chairman?
I can't hear your answer. What is your answer to that?
My answer is that it's clear...
I've given you the facts.
My answer is that it's a clear part of the historical record, which I think nobody who isn't a cynic will dispute, that the South not only didn't encourage its Negroes to vote, but encouraged them not to vote, so much so that we actually got a piece of legislation which wrested from the states the right to make their own decisions concerning qualifications, because in the judgment of the majority of Congress they had been cynically made. Incidentally, I was out of sympathy with that particular measure and still am. But I think for anybody to try to persuade people that the South has encouraged its Negroes to vote...
Let's get Governor Wallace's answer to that.
Well, the implication of your statement is that in New York State and the other states from whence you come, everything's milk and honey about voting.
No, he's talking about the South.
No, but you said, you're talking about, where has the race riots occurred? They occur in the South? And
that wasn't Mr. Buckley's point. He says that the South was basically out of sympathy with Negro enfranchisement. Do you agree with that, or don't you?
No, I think they're basically out of sympathy with franchisement of people who are not qualified under the laws of a particular state. In Alabama, people were not allowed to vote if they couldn't read or write or sign their name, and take a simple literacy test in which the answers to the test were right on the test itself. Of course, the news media, when they gave the questions that were asked, didn't give the fact that right below that in a little box were all the answers that you could read and get the answers, and that we gave this test to the sixth graders in Alabama, and 98.2% of all the sixth grade students in Alabama passed the literacy test that we gave for voting. Then the federal government comes along and passes a law that says that illiterates in 5 states can vote. But that same illiterate registered in Alabama who cannot sign his name moves to New York, he cannot vote. So an illiterate has more civil rights in Alabama than they do in New York or
How about
California.
that, Mr. Buckley? Let's get Mr. Buckley's
Well, I think that the government of Alabama can only be understood in terms of a reflection of the literacy of its voters. I've never been in favor of necessarily increasing the franchise. I've simply been against its being denied on the basis of color. Once again, I'm not going to here try to substantiate the fact that the Negroes have not had the same civil liberties in the South that the white people have, because this would be a venture in redundancy.
Well,
I simply asked George
let me
Wallace
say this.
to
You can sit
accept
here and
this.
reflect on the people of Alabama about the literacy of Alabama voters is with the governor of Alabama. But I want to tell you one thing, that I'm going to run for the presidency, possibly in '68. And I think that I have as much rapport with the voters as any of these so-called conservatives that you talk about.
Well, yes,
fact,
but the question is, do they understand?
No,
you,
but
Mr.
you
Wallace?
reflected upon the literacy of the people of our state. That's true. We've had some illiteracy.
Yeah.
But the great epoch in American history has been the comeback of the people of our region after 25 or 30 years of retrenchment, 20 or 30 years of occupation, of 100 years of economic discriminations placed upon the shoulders of black and white alike in our region of the country. And so your reflection upon the people of our region, of course, is not well taken.
No,
because
well,
the people of our region have come further with less than the people of any section of our country. And I'm very proud of the fact that they've done so. And I think you're going to find that when I go throughout the country in 1968, this year, that you're going to find people from California to New York who are going to support our movement. And I think that you're going to find that the brand of conservatism that you criticize in me is a brand of conservatism that's not electable. In fact, I am not a reactionary. I'm not against caring for the elderly, as you mentioned a moment ago.
Yes.
What else in Alabama now, since you base your record about being non-conservative in Alabama, what else have I done in Alabama that you are against?
Well, I think you've misled the people of Alabama.
Well, how have I misled them?
Well, you've misled them, for instance, into believing that you had their impartial interests in mind in taking the various steps that you have taken, just as in my judgment...
Well, name one thing I've done now.
Well, just as in my judgment, in going to Maryland and Missouri.
Why misled them?
Yeah.
You see, it's easy for you to reflect on my integrity here, because that's your stock in trade.
Governor,
You said I misled them, see,
Yes,
but of course I didn't.
I think you have.
Because that's a supercilious, sanctimonious...
Let Mr. Buckley say how you misled them.
I think that if
you
the
think I
Negro...
wittingly misled them?
I think if the...
Misled them in what respect, Mr.
You think
we,
I wittingly
we know
misled
that you
them?
were very much concerned about elections. You've been peppering your conversation during the past half hour about this being electable
Well,
and that not being electable.
You ran for an election,
But
too,
I wasn't elected.
Oh,
You see,
that's
this is my
right.
badge of honor.
You're not an elected. In fact, not
That's right.
enough people believed in what you talked about to elect you, but they did me.
Mr. Buckley, you've said that Governor Wallace misled the people of Alabama.
Yes.
At what respect? How?
Because in terms of the relationship of forces in America, Mr. Wallace is primarily distinguishable in virtue of his position on the race issue. Otherwise, there are practically no differences between his position and mine, his position and Governor Reagan's. He has a great contempt for Governor Reagan, or so he expressed a while ago to some newspaper reporter. Governor Reagan is sold out. He's a namby-pamby conservative, all kinds of things.
I want to tell you that whoever told you that told you an unmitigated
It was published.
falsehood.
It was
And I
published
have,
and republished.
Well, Art, I've never made a statement about Governor Reagan at all.
Well,
and
you
you said that I have a contempt for Governor Reagan. There's not. I have no contempt for Nixon, for Roosevelt, for Johnson, for Romney or Rockefeller, and I've never made a statement that reflected upon them personally. And anyone who says I said
I didn't mean that you had
said something that was not true.
Personally, their policy is presumed.
Mr. Buckley, Governor, Mr. Buckley says you're misunderstanding him. What would you clarify?
No, I'm not.
This was a statement made by Mr. Tom Anderson, who is a great enthusiast for Mr. Wallace, in the American Opinion magazine, and republished in National Review. And I have yet to hear either from Mr. Wallace or from any friend of Mr. Wallace to dispute the accuracy of it.
I think Mr. Anderson, if he thought I said that, that I reflected on him in any statement that I made publicly on the record, is certainly he made a mistake in that regard.
If Mr. Reagan was nominated, in that case, would you not run for president?
If he ran on the proper platform, I would not.
What is the proper?
The proper platform is to turn domestic institutions back to the people of the states on the domestic issue.
But not federal aid.
Schools. Listen, now let's talk about federal aid.
Yeah,
you mentioned a moment ago, yes, Alabama gets so-called federal aid, but you know as well as I know there's no such thing as federal aid. It comes out of the pockets of the taxpayers.
No, it depends on the state.
Well, it doesn't make any difference. It comes out of the
certain beneficiary states and certain...
Well, that may be true.
Yeah.
But we send foreign aid
more than they give.
We have to interrupt now. We will be back in a moment.
Without any strings attached. Send aid to our own states, they won't attach many strings. Yes, we get federal aid because it's really taxpayers' aid. The federal government has never made a dime in its life, nor the state of Missouri or Alabama, or the state of New York.
You're telling me something I knew when I was 3 years old.
Did you? Well, I didn't know whether you knew that or not, and I wanted to. Well, I wanted to.
I've
never read any of your books, but I want to say this: let me answer. Will you do that, please, sir?
Well, you have made your point, and
I haven't made my point.
What is your point?
My point is that we continue to get federal aid, so-called, because we pay taxes also, and because 4 cents of the gas tax in Alabama goes to the federal government. And so we're not against the getting of the aid that comes from the pockets of taxpayers in the country that the states are entitled to. We are against the controls. Now, I hope the day will come, in peacetime especially, when we can lower federal taxes and let the states recoup themselves and use the money as they see fit without the strings attached on the federal level.
Mr. Buckley, what do you think?
I'm very much in favor of that.
What do you think about attaching strings, as Governor Wallace says, to aid supplied to the states?
I've been against it since I was 16 years old, or whenever. I'm very much against it, but at the same time I recognize that there are always going to be strings. It's almost a metaphysical difficulty. If you take money and send it to Mississippi or Alabama or Arizona, it's going to end up there with certain conditions. This is almost in the nature of the act. Now, Alabama pays federal taxes, true, but Alabama takes in many, many more dollars than
Well, where are your figures on that? You got them right there?
No, but I'll tell you what.
Well, what are they?
Mike, I'll consult
Well, you've made a charge against Alabama.
I will commune
You've asked
with the World Almanac and give you a figure that won't be more than 15% off.
Well, go get it.
My guess is that you take in at least 5 times as much from the federal government as you send out.
I make the statement that that's totally untrue. Now, that's not correct.
Well, suppose I give you
figures?
I happen to know the figures for Mississippi exactly.
Well, Alabama's
those
not
are 10 to 1. That's why I sort of cut that in half.
It's not 10 to 1 in Mississippi in the first place. I'll say that that's wrong.
Yeah, well, it's 10 to 1 as of the World Almanac a couple of years ago. In any case,
you're just making a charge which you have no substantial proof here.
No, but I don't think you really want to dispute that.
I just say that you're not telling the truth about it.
Mr.
You
Wallace,
just, in your over-zealousness,
Governor, let's get down to the specific question. Is it your thesis that Alabama pays as much in federal aid as it gets?
I don't necessarily say they pay as much in federal aid. I don't know exactly. I've seen the figures, but it's not any 5 or 10 to 1. But if it is, the people of Alabama are citizens, and they are entitled to have their ability respected to determine policies of local institutions. The liberals in the country, they want to give foreign aid to nations without any strings attached. So we say, why can't you give the aid and let the goodness of the people in Alabama and Mississippi
how about that, Mr. Buckley? We give aid to foreign countries without strings attached. Why should we attach
That's the most magnificently irrelevant statement I've ever heard, because Alabama is also a member of the United States of America. That was something that was settled after a bloody war a while ago.
Well, I wish they'd treat us like we were members of the United States of America. Yes. Alabama's been treated almost as a province by the bureaucrats in the Supreme Court of the United States, and that's one reason I may be in the presidential race, that I'm tired of Alabama being treated as a province.
As a taxpayer, Governor, I don't think that a lot of Americans who are paying taxes into Alabama would necessarily adopt that position. Honestly, you're forcing me to sound like a liberal, which has never happened to me before in my entire life. I don't believe strings ought to be attached, but I do believe that Alabamans ought to be protected by the Constitution of the United States.
Well, they are protected.
Well, they have been inadequately protected.
Aren't they
protected? They haven't been inadequately protected.
Governor, let's get Mr. Buckley's bill of particulars. In what respect aren't Alabamians protected by the Constitution?
They have not been protected. For instance, in Selma, Alabama, it seemed to me notorious. that the rights of certain Negroes were not adequately protected by the sheriff down there.
Well, of course, that's totally untrue. And let me say this to you. My wife received the Negro vote in Selma. But up in New York City, who's responsible? Nobody was killed in Selma. 8 people got skin on the head, not enough to put on a postage stamp, and yet they killed 41 people in Detroit. They killed 51 in Los Angeles. So where has all the trouble erupted in our country?
Yeah,
has it been in Selma? Has it been in Newark? Has it been in New York City? Has it been in Los Angeles? Been in Detroit? Been in New Haven, Connecticut?
I've always found this one of your most interesting points. It reminded me of the American capitalists, remember, who went to the Soviet Union in 1944 and came back glistening. The Soviet Union has no trouble with labor unions, not at all. One of the reasons, of course, why there hasn't been as much crime in the South as there has been in the North, is because you have ways of dealing with crime which are, to say the least, unusual. The Ku Klux Klan, for instance, seemed to be a major law enforcer during parts of Southern history.
Well, of course, that's totally untrue. I'm not even going to answer these pseudo-intellectual
theoreticians.
Yes, you are. You're a pseudo-intellectual with a you don't like the people of Alabama.
I like the people of Alabama.
And all I'm going to say is that what you say is not true.
Well, is it also true that the Alabama Journal is wrong in saying
yes,
we believe that George Wallace's appeal in both the state and the nation is basically a refined appeal to racial prejudice?
Well, the Alabama Journal
is that owned by Alabamans?
Yes. The Alabama,
nice Alabamans or bad Alabamans?
Yes. Would you let me answer?
Sure.
The Alabama Journal wrote that the people
We have to interrupt now. We will be back in a moment.
Political bill to allow the people to vote on whether a governor should succeed themselves. They opposed my wife for governor. They opposed everything I've ever done. And my wife carried their circulation area 4 and 38% to 1.
So
4.38% votes to 1.
But that doesn't make them right, does it?
Well, you always, the editor of the Montgomery Advertiser is one man. Yeah. He's just one man, like you and me are one man. And our attitude and thought is not a bit better than the average man watching this telecast here.
Well, if we're right.
No, it's not.
Depends whether we're right or not.
Well, the editor of the newspaper's wrong in that particular instance.
Well,
why did my wife get all the Negro support? In Montgomery, Alabama, she got 5,000 votes in round numbers to 2,000 in the all-Negro ward right in the city of Montgomery.
Well, it could be because the Negroes were mistaken.
Oh, I see. They didn't know how to vote. Is that what you're charging the people in Negro voters? No, the Negro voters in Alabama have as much intelligence.
I don't think the majority of people in New York State know how to vote. After all, they turned down the opportunity to elect me mayor. So I hardly consider it scandalous to allege that the people don't know necessarily.
Well, what you were saying is the Negro voters didn't know what they were doing in Alabama.
I don't think they did. No, certainly not to the extent.
Well, how do you know that? Were you down in Alabama doing the campaign? Did you see us speak? Did you see the Negroes shake hands with my wife? Did you see their endorsements of her?
I've criticized Julius Caesar, even though I wasn't in Rome.
Well, why didn't you come down and see for yourself? Well, you're probably wrong on what you said about Julius Caesar, if you want to know the truth about it.
Well, we'll avoid debates on Julius Caesar.
Yeah. Well, actually, I spent 9 months of my life in Alabama, and
9 months, and you're an expert on it.
No, I'm not an expert, but I'm sufficiently an expert to understand why prominent and patriotic conservatives tend to shy away from your policies.
Well, who in Alabama tended to shy away from my policies?
Well, the editor of the Alabama Journal, for one.
You call him a conservative? Listen, he has said jokingly he's a Marxist. He said jokingly, said, I'm a Marxist and proud of it.
Well, what does he say seriously?
He is a Lyndon Johnson.
Don't tell me what he says jokingly. Huh? Don't tell me what he says jokingly.
I tell you, well, all right, he is for Lyndon Johnson. He's going to endorse Lyndon Johnson.
And you were for John Kennedy. I don't see that there's a difference between the policies.
I didn't understand John Kennedy's philosophy and attitude which he changed. That's right, but I was for Kennedy. But I was not for him after he was inaugurated, but nothing personal about it. I had a high regard for Mr. Kennedy personally, and I have a high regard for all of them personally. I'm not going to reflect on them personally, but this editor you're talking about is the strongest Lyndon Johnson supporter in Alabama.
Well, maybe he figures
that's the Lyndon Johnson supporter in Alabama.
He may figure that's the alternative to being a Wallace man in Alabama, because you haven't exactly encouraged a two-party system in Alabama, have you?
No, that's right. I haven't encouraged it.
Yeah.
I haven't encouraged it.
Which means that a lot of people who vote for somebody are voting for that somebody because they haven't had an opportunity to vote for somebody else.
No, they just don't believe in what I believe in, the editor of the Alabama Journal. But I might point out that that's water over the dam. The people of Alabama elected my wife overwhelmingly. She carried 65 out of 67 counties. She carried her opponent's county. She got the largest vote ever given a gubernatorial candidate in Alabama. The Alabama Journal, to the contrary notwithstanding, and some of the professional conservatives, as you say, who oppose me because they were professional Republicans. They just support anybody who's a Republican. And I don't support anybody who's a Democrat or who's a Republican. I was not for Mr. Johnson in 64.
Let's ask Mr. Buckley's comment on that.
On what?
On the fact that despite the Alabama Journal, Alabama voted overwhelmingly for Governor Wallace's wife.
I don't think there's... I don't think... Look, Mr. Wallace wouldn't be here at this moment if it weren't demonstrated that he's very popular in Alabama, and Mr. Javits is very popular in New York. I believe, I happen myself to believe in about 98% of the same things that Mr. Wallace believes in preference over those of Mr. Javits, and yet Mr. Javits is a fellow Republican. So all of these anomalies are hardly historical. What I think is of great national interest is, how will Mr. Wallace do in 1968? And the answer is, of course, that he's appealing to people to whom Mr. Goldwater appealed, Mr. Reagan appealed, but I think he's appealing to them as an imposter, because I think that Mr. Wallace's principal franchise comes from people who are concerned over this issue.
Let me say that I enjoy...
You think he's an imposter because you think basically his issue is the Reagan...
I think he's using the rhetoric of conservatism
for
anti-conservative
purposes. I enjoy being on programs, and of course I've been on many programs, Meet the Press and Face the Nation, and other programs. And I've always tried to conduct myself in the proper manner, and I've never reflected on people and their integrity. But of course, you do. You say I'm an imposter.
That doesn't have to do with your integrity.
Yes, I know, but I don't, in the first place...
You mean a political imposter, I guess.
Well,
I've said as much about Mr. Javits as a Republican. He's an imposter.
Of course, all you can do is sit up and listen to you and accept it, because that's all you can do about it. But I have never been an imposter politically. I've expressed myself in the manner that I saw fit and what I stood for, and even in '62 I had people to tell you you're going to lose the race because you're talking too strong on this issue.
I think you're as imposter as a conservative.
That's
well, to do with your integrity.
Let's get back to this. You said, now what else have I done in Alabama that
That's your favorite
you
subject,
don't like?
isn't it?
That you don't like?
I am not a student.
You against me helping the old folks? We've got that off.
We have to interrupt now. We will be back in just a moment.
What else have I done that makes me not a
I'm against roads. Sure, I'm against public health.
Well, now, of course, you're trying to be funny about it, but you're the one that made the statement that my actions as governor says I'm not a conservative. Well, what have I done in Alabama that you're against?
You are in the populist tradition, a complete, as I see it, opportunist as regards the use of funds. If they come in your direction and they can be distributed by you...
Well, what funds have I used that you wouldn't have used?
Well, I would not have voted... I put it this way, I wouldn't have aligned myself with a party which has become synonymous with a party that looks to Washington
the Democratic Party?
Yes, looks to Washington for the solution of practically every
no
problem.
No one looks to Washington
whether it's
for the
old
solution
age
of every problem.
Well, the presidents do, put it that way. I think the presidents of the United States who have been Democrats, I think, can be considered legitimate spokesmen for Democratic ideas.
What's your comment on that?
Oh, I haven't been with the National Democratic Party myself for many years. I voted. I didn't vote for Mr. Johnson in '64. I did vote for Mr. Kennedy in 1960, but I'm not for Mr. Johnson this year.
So in 1963, you started to discover what Republicans and conservatives have known now for quite a long while.
With what?
What Republicans and conservatives have known quite a long while, namely the Democratic Party is dominated by a centralist wing, which is anti-conservative. Yeah.
What's the difference?
So wouldn't it therefore be appropriate for you to disavow the Democratic Party?
I disavow them right now. I disavow the National Democratic Party.
How about resigning from it right now? How about resigning from it?
I've already resigned from it. See, you're way off. I've resigned a long time ago.
So you would not take the Democratic nomination for senator then?
No, sir. I'm not going to run for the Senate at all. Alabama Democratic Party is set up that's entirely different from the National Party. In fact, the only oath you have to take is you will support the nominees of the Alabama Democratic Party, not the National Democratic Party. And on top of that, I even resigned from any association with the modern Republican Party either. They are just almost...
Well, you never had such an association.
No, I haven't had that association
So
yet, and I don't intend to have the association. Well, I was facetious about it. But the National Republican Party today as typified by some of its leadership, in my judgment, there's not any difference in them and the National Democratic Party. That is not enough to warrant you going to the polls and voting. On the matter of the so-called civil rights legislation, which is an attack on the property ownership system, and which I believe EMU against some of those
let's
bills.
get Mr. Buckley's comment.
Let me say that Mr. Nixon, when he came to Birmingham, said he was for all the Lyndon Johnson civil rights proposals, which is an attack on the property system, which is an attack on local government, in my judgment, and
Governor,
therefore there's no difference in his attitude and that of Mr. Nixon.
Let's get Mr. Buckley's comment on that.
Well, my answer is that I do believe there is a significant difference between Mr. Nixon's Republican Party and Mr. Johnson's Democratic Party. I don't think there's much of a difference, I agree, between, let's say, Mr. Javits' Republican Party and...
Well, you ran on a third-party movement yourself because you didn't think there was any difference in New York.
So, what else is new?
Yeah. So I'm doing the same thing, but you're very critical of everything I stand for, and I've just done what you've done.
No, what is to be compared is not the fact that we both ran on third parties, but whether or not we both defended a particular position. Now, you say, let people decide what you are on their own, but I say, you are using the rhetoric of conservatism for illicit
anything
ends.
you want to say.
Yeah.
You have taken the attitude in the National Review, Mr. Buckley, that anyone who doesn't agree with you is not a conservative.
No.
That I am the messiah of the conservative cause.
no.
Yes, you have, and
Because
that's your general reputation throughout the United States.
National
And
Review
if you
has-
don't agree with you, then that makes you a flaming liberal, and that makes you not correct. But I want you to know that you aren't the fountainhead of conservatism.
No, I
in the
didn't say I
country.
was.
In fact, I have more support right now in the country than you do.
I
How
can't
about
find-
that? Are you the fountainhead of
No,
conservatism?
certainly not. I can't think of a single editor of National Review, and there are 7 of them who agrees with me on everything. So we have seven editors. And
you've
two
had
of them don't agree on anything.
Mr. Buckley, do you
I
purport?
believe you had 2 editors that were cited a time or 2, weren't they? You got rid of them.
Tell us about that,
Huh?
Governor. Tell
Well,
us
I've heard
about
that. Is that correct? I don't know. I'm asking you. I don't know.
Cited for what, Governor?
I believe I saw the other day
It's gonna be
where I believe
fun.
Mr. H.L. Hunt or somebody wrote a letter, and I'm not committing Mr. Hunt, but what I'm trying to
what
say,
were
you're
they
not to be...
cited for?
I
No,
don't
go
know.
ahead.
They were cited for being against Wallace.
Well,
Cited for being against what?
they were cited for being against Wallace.
What do you mean by cited?
Well, just cited. That's just an old Southern expression. We cite you to it. I cite you to the fact that
No,
you
what
think
are
you're
you
the
talking about? We're citing
fountainhead of
as
the
having
conservative movement. In
What Governor Wallace...
We have run out of time. We want to thank Mr. Buckley, his guest, Governor Wallace, moderator C. Dickerman Williams, and the students of Webster College.
Since then, they have been...
What is that definition?
Well, he said-